everyone. My name's Sydnie Christmas.
Is it?
Sydnie Christmas.
When Sydnie Christmas took the Britain's Got Talent stage for her audition, few could have predicted the emotional tidal wave that was about to sweep across the nation. Dressed modestly, with humble energy and a slightly shaky smile, Sydnie gave no outward indication of the emotional storm brewing just beneath her poised exterior. But the moment she began to sing Tomorrow from Annie, the entire room changed. Judges sat upright, stunned, while the audience collectively held its breath. Her vocals weren't just technically brilliant, they were raw, drenched in aching emotion, and layered with a sadness too personal to fake. This wasn't just a performance, it was a public exorcism of grief. Newsrooms across the UK lit up that evening with headlines about the unknown girl with the golden voice. But beneath those headlines was a truth. Few grasped in full, Sydnie wasn't just singing a song, she was channeling years of unresolved heartbreak. Her voice cracked slightly on a lyric about hope and new beginnings. And that's when Simon Cowell's eyes welled up, a rare, telling moment of genuine emotional resonance on a show known for theatricality. It was as though she was singing through the shattered pieces of her past, trying desperately to glue herself back together with every note. Viewers flooded social media with messages like "I don't even know her," and "I'm crying," and "that voice has lived through something." The overnight sensation label stuck fast, but for Sydnie, it wasn't fame she was chasing, it was healing. Her audition became more than a viral moment, it was a cultural touchstone, a reminder that talent isn't just about skill, it's about vulnerability. In that 4-minute song, Sydnie reminded us all that sometimes the most beautiful performances are born from the deepest pain. Let that be your reminder, the bravest voices are the ones that tremble. Most viewers assumed Sydnie chose Tomorrow from Annie simply for its theatrical familiarity, but in truth, the song's hopeful lyrics masked a haunting, deeply personal backstory that few knew at the time. Behind the lyrics, "The sun'll come out tomorrow," lay the ghost of someone she had lost, someone whose absence turned each morning into a quiet battle. Insiders later revealed that Sydnie had originally considered a different song, one with more vocal acrobatics, but changed her mind just hours before the audition. Why? Because Tomorrow was the lullaby her mother once sang to her during a brutal chapter of family illness and emotional unraveling. That simple, childlike melody carried the weight of late-night hospital visits, whispered prayers, and one final voicemail that Sydnie still listens to when she's alone. When she stood on that stage, she wasn't just performing, she was reliving. Every lyric carried echoes of a mother-daughter bond, tested by grief and fortified by love. When she sang "Just Thinking About Tomorrow" clears away the cobwebs and the sorrow, she wasn't projecting hope for the audience, she was begging herself to believe it. And that's why the performance landed like a gut punch. Viewers felt the tremble in her voice not as weakness but as truth. According to vocal coach interviews, Sydnie refused to rehearse the final verse during prep week, saying, "I need to leave something for the moment, if I rehearse it too much I'll break." That vulnerability was by design. It was a calculated emotional risk, one that paid off not in applause but in mass empathy. People from across the globe reached out with their own stories of loss, finding solace in her trembling rendition of a song they'd heard 1,000 times before, but never like this. Sometimes it's not what you sing, it's why you sing it. And Sydnie's why was heartbreak. Long before Sydnie Christmas captivated millions with her voice, she was just a young woman trying to piece her life back together after the sudden death of the person she called her anchor, her older brother, who passed away unexpectedly in a tragic accident that shattered the very foundation of her world. The bond they shared wasn't merely familial, it was spiritual, creative, and deeply emotional, with her brother often being the first person to hear her sing new melodies, encourage her at local gigs, or leave voice notes when she doubted her talent. His death didn't just leave a void, it ripped away her confidence, turning her gift of song into a painful reminder of everything she had lost. She stopped performing for over a year, abandoning small theater gigs and even deleting demo tracks from her laptop, because they felt too raw to revisit. Friends described that period as one where Sydnie existed, but didn't live. And yet it was in the thick of this grief that she began humming to herself again. First in the kitchen, then in the car, until one day she whispered a few lyrics aloud, tears streaming down her face. Music had always been her sanctuary, but now it was also her burden. She later admitted in an interview that the only reason she auditioned for BGT was because she found an old text from her brother encouraging her to never wait for the world to call, just go sing to it anyway. That message became her mantra. So when she stood under the spotlight, the applause didn't hit her the way it did for others. What mattered was that she'd sung again, for herself and for the brother who never got to see her rise. If you've ever mourned someone who believed in your dreams more than you did, you know moving forward is the tribute. Grief doesn't end, but it sings. Long before the bright lights and national acclaim, Sydnie Christmas lived a far more ordinary yet quietly devastating life filled with missed auditions, unpaid bills and exhausting day jobs that barely allowed her to dream, let alone sing. After losing her brother and spiraling into a depressive fog, she found herself working part-time at a gym and pulling late-night shifts as a waitress, barely able to afford singing lessons or acting workshops, let alone full-scale auditions in London. Each day was a loop of survival, clock in, clock out, collapse into bed, and while others her age were landing West End roles or touring with ensembles, Sydnie was scrubbing workout mats or serving cocktails to tourists. She confessed to a friend once, "I felt like the world moved on without me." Her vocal cords weakened from disuse, and self-doubt settled in like a permanent houseguest. Still, there were moments, tiny cracks in the despair when her old spark flickered. She once sang "I Dreamed a Dream" alone in the gym's empty shower room, and a coworker heard it through the tiled walls. That coworker would later become the friend who pushed her to audition for BGT. But before that, Sydnie had to battle a far more invisible force. The fear that maybe her talent had expired, that grief had stripped her voice not just emotionally but physically. She started recording herself again in secret, analyzing every tremble and breath, trying to find the performer she used to be. What she didn't know then was that this raw, untrained, grief-worn voice was exactly what would set her apart. Not every star is born under a spotlight. Some are forged in silence. Sydnie's survival wasn't glamorous, but it was sacred. For every artist quietly struggling in the margins, your time isn't over, it's waiting. It was a rainy Thursday night at a barely attended pub in East London when Sydnie Christmas found herself reluctantly agreeing to perform at an open mic, her first public appearance in nearly 2 years, a moment she would later describe as both terrifying and redemptive. She hadn't planned on singing that night, she was only there to support a friend. But the MC recognized her name from a local showcase years earlier and urged her to get up. With trembling hands and a dry throat, she walked to the stage with no set list, no warm-up and no plan. Just a vague memory of a song her brother once told her made her sound like velvet. The room, mostly filled with chatter and clinking glasses, fell to a hush within the first 10 seconds of her performance. She sang "Make You Feel My Love" by Adele, but not in the belting powerhouse style most expect. It was quieter, almost ghostly, with pauses that felt like confessions and breaths that sounded like apologies. When she finished, there was no roaring applause, just a stunned silence and a few tears from strangers who saw something in her that even she didn't. That single moment reignited a spark she thought was long extinguished. A pub regular slipped her a note that read, "You made me cry in a good way, please never stop." That paper still sits in her wallet to this day. From that night forward, Sydnie began rebuilding not just her voice but her belief in herself. She auditioned for Fringe Theatre, took free masterclasses, and slowly gathered the confidence to submit a video to BGT. That pub performance became the unofficial rebirth of her career, a night born from grief but lit by courage. The spotlight may be loud, but true transformation begins in whispers. Courage doesn't always roar, sometimes it sings softly. Despite the emotional high of her audition and the tidal wave of public support that followed, Sydnie Christmas came dangerously close to walking away from Britain's Got Talent just weeks before the live semi-finals, blindsiding producers and leaving even her closest team members scrambling to keep her in the competition. The reason wasn't stage fright or performance anxiety, it was something far deeper, more haunting. A tabloid had published an old photo of Sydnie during a low point in her life, accompanied by a speculative headline questioning her mental health and suggesting she was unstable and unready for stardom. The article dredged up past traumas and twisted them into clickbait, triggering a panic spiral Sydnie hadn't felt since her brother's death. She reportedly locked herself in her dressing room for hours, ignoring calls and refusing meals. Her manager at the time told producers, "She's not just upset, she's re-traumatized." What saved her in that moment wasn't a producer's pep talk or a judge's reassurance. It was a voicemail from her mother reminding her, "The world may poke holes in you, but you're not made of paper." Those words became her lifeline. She emerged the next morning bleary-eyed but determined, asking only for one thing: no more press interviews. She wanted her voice to speak louder than her past. That semi-final performance, though technically brilliant, carried a different energy, controlled, urgent, like someone who knew this might be her last time on stage. When asked later why she stayed, she simply said, "Because leaving would have meant they won." Her near exit was never shown on air, but insiders claim it changed the atmosphere backstage, with crew and contestants alike treating her with a quiet reverence after that day. Resilience isn't just surviving attacks, it's choosing to stand tall anyway. Critics question, survivors perform. What viewers didn't see during Sydnie Christmas's emotional semi-final performance was a private moment backstage that left even the famously stoic Simon Cowell shaken. A rare, unscripted admission that revealed how profoundly her journey had pierced the heart of one of television's most powerful figures. As the final note of her ballad hung in the air and the standing ovation thundered through the studio, Sydnie exited the stage and passed within feet of the judge's private corridor. Simon, typically known for his rigid professionalism, reportedly stood motionless for several seconds before following her and asking for a word. In a hushed exchange shielded from cameras, he admitted, "You remind me of someone I lost." Though he didn't elaborate, crew members present described his expression as deeply emotional, bordering on vulnerable, a stark contrast to the biting analytical persona he's built over decades in the spotlight. One stagehand said it was the only time he'd ever seen Cowell reach for tissues. He then told Sydnie that her voice carries pain in a way only real pain teaches, and encouraged her to ignore headlines and lean into authenticity. That brief exchange wasn't just validation, it was a lifeline, a sign that her pain had not only been heard but felt. Though she didn't speak about the moment publicly for months, Sydnie later said in a podcast interview that Simon's words helped her believe she belonged in the competition, not as a viral novelty, but as a true artist. What audiences witnessed that night wasn't just talent, it was a shared understanding between two people shaped by grief. Fame can feel manufactured, but empathy never is. Sometimes the coldest judges recognize the deepest wounds. While Sydnie Christmas became a household name almost overnight, what the public didn't realize was how much of her strength during Britain's Got Talent came not from fame or fans, but from the unlikely surrogate family she found among the show's crew: makeup artists, sound engineers, and production runners who quickly evolved from staff to support system. Long days on set often triggered her anxiety, especially during rehearsals when certain songs would stir memories she wasn't prepared to face. During one particularly difficult rehearsal, she broke down mid-song and fled to a corner of the set, sobbing quietly. It was a lighting technician named Zoe, who sat beside her without a word, simply holding her hand until the tears subsided. Moments like these became frequent and profound, with backstage staff routinely leaving notes of encouragement in her dressing room, sneaking her favorite peppermint tea between calls, and even walking her through breathing exercises before each appearance. One producer confided that Sydnie had an unspoken pact with several crew members. She would perform as long as they promised to meet her eyes just before the curtain rose, so she'd feel anchored. That level of behind-the-scenes support is rare in competitive entertainment, where pressure and ratings often eclipse humanity. But in Sydnie's case, the crew didn't see a contestant, they saw a woman trying to survive grief in real time, and they responded not as employees but as friends. Their kindness didn't make headlines, but it made history for her. Long after the confetti settled, she kept in touch with nearly every member of that core team, even attending the wedding of one sound engineer who had comforted her between tapings. Stardom might put you on a stage, but love keeps you standing, and for Sydnie that love wore headsets and carried cables. The night of the Britain's Got Talent finale wasn't just the climax of a television season, it was the emotional culmination of Sydnie Christmas's personal odyssey, a breathtaking performance that masked a storm of nerves, grief, and whispered prayers happening backstage, just minutes before she walked into the spotlight. As she prepared to sing her final number, an original arrangement she co-wrote as a tribute to her late brother and mother, the air in her dressing room was thick with emotion. Her hands trembled as she clutched a tiny charm bracelet that had belonged to her mother, a last-minute token slipped into her hand by a crew member who'd remembered its significance from earlier conversations. Just before the curtain rose, Sydnie closed her eyes and whispered, "This is for you, both of you." The lights came up, the music swelled, and what followed was nothing short of electrifying. Her voice rose and fell like a tide, gentle in moments, shattering in others, and when she hit the final note, the audience erupted in the kind of applause that feels more like gratitude than praise. But what viewers didn't know was that moments before that performance, she had nearly broken down after receiving a text from a family member reminding her of her brother's birthday, which happened to fall on that very day. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears throughout the performance, and many fans would later say they felt the pain woven into her voice. When the winner's name was announced and it was Sydnie, she didn't smile immediately. Instead, she looked upward and mouthed, "Thank you." It wasn't just victory, it was closure. That night didn't mark the beginning of a career. It marked the end of a chapter haunted by silence and self-doubt. Standing ovations are powerful, but spiritual release is louder. Even as Sydnie Christmas stood under the confetti showers of Britain's Got Talent glory, smiling for cameras and holding the winner's bouquet, an unshakable hollowness lingered beneath the surface, because the one person she most wanted to share the moment with was gone, and no amount of public validation could fill that quiet absence. The press circled her with microphones and questions, asking about record deals, tour plans, and her dreams for the future, but no one asked what she'd sacrificed to get there. In her hotel room that night, after the celebrations ended, Sydnie reportedly sat alone, listening to a voice memo her brother had sent her years ago, an off-key silly birthday song he'd recorded for her on a whim. She cried quietly for nearly an hour, exhausted not by the performance, but by the emotional weight she had carried alone. Fame can be isolating, and for Sydnie, the days following her win brought an overwhelming rush of media appearances, interviews and brand offers, but they also brought silence where love once lived. Every congratulatory headline reminded her of what she no longer had: a brother to hug her, a mother to toast her, a family circle complete. Fans flooded her social media with admiration, unaware that their heroine was grieving in designer gowns. Her smile on talk shows was real, but it was layered over fatigue, survivor's guilt, and the relentless ache of absence. Only her closest friends knew that behind each red carpet appearance was a small ritual. She wore her mother's bracelet and touched it before every camera flash. Her public win was undeniable, but her private mourning never ended. Success shines bright, but grief casts long shadows. For Sydnie, both arrived on the same night. In the weeks following her Britain's Got Talent victory, Sydnie Christmas seemingly vanished from public view, a curious silence that left fans and media outlets puzzled as speculations swirled about her next move. One moment she was the face of hope and raw talent, and the next she was noticeably absent from magazine covers, red carpets, and even her own social media. The truth behind that disappearance was far more complex than a simple PR strategy. It was an emotional necessity. According to close friends, Sydnie retreated to a quiet seaside village where she could breathe without performing, as she put it. The sudden rush of fame had collided with the long-dormant grief she had carried into the competition, and the result was emotional exhaustion on a scale few could imagine. Fans flooded her inbox with questions and concern, but Sydnie remained silent, choosing instead to spend time journaling, walking by the coast, and reconnecting with parts of herself that had been eclipsed by the whirlwind of public attention. One tabloid speculated she was undergoing vocal surgery, a claim her team quietly denied, but the real recovery was emotional, not physical. She began attending private grief counseling sessions and stepped away from industry meetings, reportedly turning down multiple record label offers in favor of simply being still. Her only creative output during that time was a series of handwritten lyrics never shared publicly, poems written to her brother and mother, folded into a leather-bound notebook she's kept since high school. The woman who had inspired millions with her voice needed time to heal in silence. Not all disappearances are breakdowns, some are breakthroughs. In a world that demands constant noise, choosing quiet is revolutionary. Behind the spotlight and record-breaking viewership numbers lies an often overlooked truth. The entertainment industry, for all its glamour, applies brutal pressure on emerging artists like Sydnie Christmas, especially when they're still emotionally healing. Days after her Britain's Got Talent win, she was inundated with label offers, branding proposals and management deals. Each one promising the world, yet demanding parts of her she wasn't ready to give. One contract required her to record an upbeat pop EP within 4 weeks, complete with promotional choreography and a full press tour, a far cry from the ballads and stripped-down acoustic sets that had defined her identity. When she pushed back, requesting more time to develop material rooted in authenticity, one executive reportedly told her, "Strike now or be forgotten." That phrase haunted her. The notion that grief had an expiration date, that vulnerability needed to be marketable, was both dehumanizing and cruel. Sydnie struggled under the weight of expectations, with even supportive mentors urging her to capitalize while it's hot. What few realized was that every press appearance, every contract negotiation, reopened emotional wounds she had barely started to stitch closed. She became plagued by panic attacks and nightmares, often waking in the middle of the night convinced she'd lost her voice entirely. Her team eventually stepped in and paused all commitments, shielding her from the rising tide of commercial pressure. One agent confessed anonymously, "We were watching her break in slow motion. The pressure to produce nearly silenced the very thing that made her special, her authenticity." Success isn't always about acceleration, sometimes it's about pause. For Sydnie, saying no wasn't resistance, it was survival. While the world waited for a grand debut album or high-profile concert tour, Sydnie Christmas was quietly undergoing a far more meaningful transformation. One that didn't involve producers, stage lights, or viral press, but rather quiet mornings, handwritten lyrics, and long walks spent reclaiming the parts of herself that fame had nearly stolen. In the months following her self-imposed retreat, Sydnie made the deliberate choice to stay away from the industry's demands and instead poured her energy into healing on her own terms. She began volunteering at a local arts outreach program, teaching music and emotional expression to young people grappling with anxiety, trauma, and loss. Many of these students had never heard of Britain's Got Talent, which suited Sydnie just fine. It allowed her to exist as a human, not a headline. She found solace in guiding others to do what she herself had once been too afraid to attempt: sing through the pain. Her time at the outreach center became a lifeline, both for her and the kids she mentored. One young girl, after weeks of refusing to speak in group therapy, finally broke her silence by humming a tune Sydnie had taught her, and in that moment Sydnie realized her voice still had purpose, even if it never graced a sold-out arena. She also started composing again, not for release but for release, as in emotional catharsis. Lyrics scribbled into coffee-stained notebooks, melodies hummed into old phone recorders, and piano chords played for no one but herself. For the first time in years, she wasn't performing to impress, she was creating to survive. True healing doesn't need an audience. And sometimes, the quietest songs are the ones that echo the loudest. Months after her Britain's Got Talent win, and well outside the public eye, Sydnie Christmas returned to the stage, not at a commercial concert hall or television set, but at a small charity gala benefiting bereaved children, where she delivered a performance so emotionally devastating that even jaded entertainment insiders found themselves in tears. The event was hosted by a foundation close to her heart, one that had helped her family navigate grief counseling after the loss of her brother. Unpublicized and invitation only, the evening was intended to be intimate, reflective, and deeply personal, and Sydnie chose to debut an original composition titled, "If You're Listening," a song she wrote in memory of her loved ones. As she took the stage, there were no dramatic lights or pyrotechnics, just a single spotlight, a grand piano, and a room full of strangers who had come not to celebrate fame but to mourn and heal together. The first line of the song, "I Still Set the Table for Two," hit the audience like a thunderclap, and by the chorus, several guests, including 2 former BGT producers in attendance, were visibly sobbing. One judge who had flown in anonymously for the event said afterward, "That was the most honest performance I've ever seen in my life, and I've seen thousands." Unlike the competition, there was no trophy, no applause meter, no ratings bump. There was only raw truth poured into every note, every lyric, every breath. After the final chord faded, Sydnie whispered, "Thank you for listening," and walked off stage without fanfare. That performance was never recorded, by her request. "Some things," she said, "are too sacred for playback. Not all shows need a stage. Sometimes, the best ones happen in silence, and stay only in memory." Without a media tour or brand partnership, Sydnie Christmas became a quiet yet powerful voice in the ongoing conversation about mental health, particularly grief, trauma, and the often invisible struggles that lie beneath public success. Rather than posting curated mental health content or launching a wellness brand, Sydnie opted for something far more personal: honest conversations. In small group therapy circles, intimate school visits, and closed-door industry panels, she began speaking candidly about the emotional toll of losing loved ones, the disorientation that comes with sudden fame, and the quiet shame many artists feel when they can't bounce back on command. One of her most poignant moments came during a community center conda, where a teenager asked, "How do you stop being scared of tomorrow?" Sydnie took a deep breath and responded, "You don't. You just sing through the fear and let tomorrow catch up." That phrase went viral when someone recorded it and shared it online, not because it was polished, but because it was real. She also quietly funded therapy scholarships for underprivileged youth, refusing to attach her name to the initiative publicly, until a grateful parent revealed her generosity in a thank you letter that made its way to local press. While her peers chased spotlighted campaigns, Sydnie chose to let her actions speak for her. She later admitted in a rare interview that her own path to healing involved more crying in parked cars than inspirational montages, and that's exactly why she wants others to know they're not alone in their messiness. Her message was never wrapped in perfection, but in persistence. Visibility isn't always loud. Sometimes, advocacy wears no makeup and holds your hand in silence. For all the compassion Sydnie Christmas inspired, the media's appetite for drama inevitably came crashing in, and the consequences were both personal and far-reaching. After a brief hiatus from the public eye, she returned for a single interview meant to promote a local mental health initiative, but a tabloid cherry-picked her quotes, twisted her vulnerability into sensationalism, and ran a headline that read, "BGT winner admits breakdown, fears career over." The fallout was immediate. Brands backed away, industry whispers began to question her stability, and social media lit up with cruel speculation about whether she was spiraling. What they ignored, of course, was the fact that Sydnie had not broken down, she had opened up. Her honesty about grief and emotional fatigue had been a gift, not a weakness. But in the echo chamber of celebrity culture, vulnerability is often weaponized. Rather than retaliate, Sydnie disappeared again, this time by choice and with purpose. She deleted her social apps, moved in with a close friend in the countryside, and focused solely on writing music, journaling, and baking, yes, baking, as a form of therapy. A handwritten note she taped to her mirror read, "They can't report what they can't understand." It became her shield against the noise. Only months later did her team release a quiet statement correcting the narrative, but the damage had been done. In interviews with friends, they described the media episode as a violation of trust that reminded Sydnie why she'd been so reluctant to share her story in the first place. She would later say, "If telling the truth costs me fame, I'll pay that bill gladly." The spotlight may frame you, but it can also blind you. For Sydnie, truth was worth the shadows. In the middle of her lowest post-fame moment, Sydnie Christmas received a letter from a teenage girl named Hannah that would ultimately shift the entire trajectory of her emotional journey and her future career. The letter arrived in a plain envelope, no return address, and simply read, "I wanted to die until I heard you sing." What followed was a 3-page handwritten story of abuse, silence, and slow healing that paralleled Sydnie's own pain in uncanny ways. Hannah wrote about hiding in her closet to avoid her parents' fights, about losing her older sister to suicide, and about feeling invisible in every room she entered. until one night a YouTube autoplay brought her Sydney's audition. "You sounded like someone who had been through it, but still had a voice," the girl wrote. Sydney was so moved that she immediately called her therapist, then sobbed for nearly an hour. That letter didn't just comfort her, it reminded her of why she sang in the first place. It was the kind of moment every artist dreams of, but few receive undeniable proof that their pain had purpose. In the weeks that followed, Sydney framed the letter and placed it beside her piano. Whenever she felt self-doubt creeping in, she'd reread it like a sacred mantra. Eventually she reached out to the foundation that helped deliver the message, hoping to meet Hannah, but the girl had declined, saying only, "She saved me. She doesn't need to thank me." That kind of impact transcends chart positions, record deals, or televised moments. One voice, one night, one performance, it can change someone's life. In Sydney's case, it also helped change her own. When you feel small, remember someone out there is listening. Today Sydnie Christmas stands not just as a singer, but as a woman reborn, stronger, softer, and more centered than ever before, with a new mission that blends music, healing, and emotional honesty into something greater than fame. She's currently working on her debut album, but with a twist. Each song will be accompanied by a journal entry and a short spoken word track that explains the emotional journey behind the lyrics. She calls it the Grief Sessions, a hybrid project that is less about chart-topping success and more about emotional resonance. She's producing the project independently, with partial funding coming from community donations and mental health grants. In a world where artists are often told to separate personal pain from professional output, Sydney is daring to do the opposite, fusing her vulnerability into the core of her artistry. She's also launching a podcast featuring unscripted conversations with people who've endured grief, trauma, or radical life change, aiming to amplify voices that are rarely heard beyond clinical spaces. While major labels have renewed their interest, she's made it clear she will only partner with those who honor her boundaries and her vision. "I don't want to be a product, I want to be a lighthouse," she recently told an intimate audience during a private showcase. That quote has already made its way onto fan t-shirts. Sydney isn't chasing stardom anymore, she's walking toward legacy. For anyone who's ever been told to toughen up, move on, or silence their story, she stands as a living rebuke. Heartbreak may bend you, but it doesn't have to bury you. Sometimes the most unforgettable voices are forged in silence, and rise not to entertain but to illuminate. Sydnie Christmas's story is a powerful reminder that beneath the glitter of talent shows and the roar of public applause, there are often quiet battles, devastating losses, and private triumphs that never make it to air. Her voice may have won a competition, but it's her heart and her healing that left a deeper mark. If you want more raw human stories like this, subscribe now, because next week we're uncovering another journey you'll never forget.